For today's video, we will discuss the firmware, but before we go to the deeper part of it, let's differentiate the software and the firmware. Okay, so software and firmware are both types of computer programs, but they have some key differences. Software is a general term that refers to any programs that runs on a computer or device. It can be installed, uninstalled, or customized by the user. Software can range from operating systems to applications such as Word, processor, and games. Firmware, on the other hand, is a specific type of software that is pre-installed on a piece of hardware and provides the necessary instruction for the device to function. Firmware is not intended to be modified or customized by the user, and it's typically not as visible as software. Example of firmwares include the BIOS, UEFI, and the software that runs on routers, printers, and other devices. Firmware and software both provide instruction to the computer or device, but firmware is more low level and responsible for basic functions such as power management, input, output, and interfacing with other hardware components. Software, on the other hand, is responsible for more advanced functions such as running application and providing a user interface. Firmware is a critical component of many devices as it provides the necessary instruction for the device to function. Without firmware, a device will be unable to boot or interact with other hardware components. Firmware updates are typically released to fix bugs, improve performance, and add new features to the device. In summary, software and firmware are both types of computer programs, but they have some key differences. Software is a general term that refers to any program that runs on a computer or devices. And firmware is a specific type of software that is pre-installed on a piece of hardware and provides the necessary instruction for the device to function. Firmware is not intended to be modified or customized by the user, and it's typically not as visible as software.
In 1967, American computer scientist Asher Opler developed the term firmware. He called it a microprogram between hardware and software. Firmware is programming that's written to a hardware device non-volatile memory. Non-volatile memory is a form of static random access memory where the content is saved when a hardware device is turned off. During the manufacturing, hardware is factory installed with the firmware. It is used to run user program on the device and can be thought of as the software that enables hardware to run. It's closer to the hardware than traditional software, and it's often specially designed to work with a particular piece of hardware. This hardware can include a wide ranges of devices such as computers, mobile devices, routers, and even some type of appliances. When it comes to the computers, firmware can include the BIOS or UEFI, which provide the necessary instructions for device to boot and interact with other hardware components such as processor, memory, and storage. In mobile devices, firmware can control the device power management, manage input-output, and interface with other hardware components such as camera and display. In networking devices like routers, the firmware manage the network connections, the security protocols, and the routing of the data. In appliances, firmware can control the operations and interfaces of the device. Firmware is rarely modifiable and updating can be more complicated than updating software. Manufacturers may provide firmware upgrades periodically to patch faults and add new features.
And let's move on to the storage option of firmware. Firmware storage refers to the location where firmware is stored on a device. This can include internal memory, such as flash memory on a device, or external storage, such as USB drive or cloud storage. In the beginning, the firmware was written on rolled chips. This allowed it to be produced at a low cost while also ensuring that it would not be deleted. Additionally, PROM is a programmable read-only memory chips were used to provide a wider selection of firmware alternatives. In case ROM and PROM are used to store firmware, the firmware of the device can only be replaced and not updated if it has become obsolete. The difference between firmware and drivers is that firmware instructs the device on operating, whereas the driver connects the operating system to the hardware. As technology advanced increasingly, firmware began to become outdated before the hardware. After that, manufacturers started using EEPROM chips, which made it possible to change the firmware. But because EEPROM chips are expensive to make and update, firmware gradually developed to flash memory chips, which are inexpensive and simple to write or rewrite on. When it comes to firmware storage, it is important to consider the storage capacity and reliability of the storage option. How is firmware categorized? Firmware is classified based on where it is stored and the complexity of its functionality. There are three categories. 1. Low-level firmware is stored on non-volatile memory chips like ROM and PROM, also known as one-time programmable OTP memory, and PLA, programmable logic array architectures. Low-level firmware is considered an integral element of hardware since it is frequently stored on read-only chips that cannot be changed or updated. 2. High-level firmware is used to facilitate upgrades on memory chips. It frequently contains more complicated instructions than low-level, making it more software over hardware. 3. Subsystem is component or unit that is part of a large system that is semi-independent. It resembles its device since its microcode is incorporated in flash chips, CPUs, and LCD units and is comparable to high-level firmware. BIOS modems and video cards are usually easy to upgrade as tech advances. However, hard disk and USB flash drive firmware is often disregarded. Upgrades are less often because the storage device's capabilities are limited and it's not as important to update it as often.
Why are firmware updates important and how do they work? Firmware updates are often sent out to fix bugs, stop hackers from getting into the firmware, add new features, make the security better, or let the device work with new media. The code in a firmware update tells the hardware how to behave in a new or modified way. Some examples of firmware updates include the following. The first one, a CD disk writer gains the ability to burn a new type of disk. The second one, a router gets an update that improves its performance and stability. And the last one, a motherboard manufacturer releases a BIOS update that enables the motherboard to support new processors. BIOS is motherboard firmware. Some devices that are connected to the internet automatically check for new firmware and download and install it when they find it. For some devices, the user has to go to the manufacturer's website to download and install firmware updates. Updates are often put out by manufacturers. To check for updates of firmware, you typically need to access the device settings menu and look for a firmware update option. The exact location of this option can vary depending on the device and the manufacturer. Once you have access to the firmware update option, the device will check for available updates and let you know if one is available. To download and install firmware, you will typically need to follow these steps. Check for available firmware updates as described above. Download the firmware update package to your device or computer. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for installing the firmware update. This may involve connecting your device to a computer and using specialized software to install the update. Or it may involve simply clicking a button to begin the installation process. Troubleshooting firmware can be a bit more complex and will depend on the specific issue you are experiencing. Here are a few general tips. Check the manufacturer's website for any known issues or solutions related to the firmware version you are using. Try restoring the device to its factory settings, which can often resolve issues caused by corrupted firmware. If the device is not responding, try performing a hard reset. If the issue persists, contact the manufacturer for further assistance. If available, try to roll back to previous firmware version. It is also important to note that not all firmware issues can be resolved by the end user and might need professional assistance.
Versioning firmware is the process of issuing unique version numbers to firmware releases. This is necessary for tracking changes and discovering bugs or compatibility concerns. Typically, firmware versions numbers consist of a string of digits or letters indicating the level of firmware release. For instance, a firmware version number of 1.0 would indicate that the release is the initial version, whereas a firmware version number of 2.1 would indicate that it is the second release and the first update to that release. Additional information, such as build numbers or release dates, might be included in firmware version numbers. This information is useful for identifying certain versions and tracing the evolution of firmware development.
Firmware versioning is essential for manufacturers since it enables them to keep track of the various issued firmware versions, allowing them to find and solve faults, enhance performance, and add new features. It also enables them to determine the firmware version of operating on a certain device, which can be useful for troubleshooting and customer service. For customers, firmware versioning enables them to determine which version of firmware is currently installed on their device, allowing them to determine if a newer version is available and if it addresses any issues or offers new features that they find useful.
On the other hand, we will show you on how does firmware or software versioning works.
So what is software versioning? Hi, my name is Robert Proctor, and for the last 20 years I've been involved in the launch of over 1,000 network marketing companies. Today, only 10% of those companies are still in business. 90% failed. I want to give you some tips and tools, some hints and suggestions to look for when you're launching a network marketing company to be part of the 10% and avoid being part of that 90%. So what is software versioning? This is a question when you're shopping for MLM software, you should be asking your software provider if they version their software. What does software versioning mean? Well, it means that company A buys the MLM software and they get version 1 of the software. It's got some certain features and benefits, some modules, etc. Now company B buys another version of the software, we'll call that version 2, and they've got some different features, functionality in the software. And now company 3, you, buys the software and you've got some different features, some different functionality in the software. When the MLM software company upgrades their software in a versioning software system, typically they'll go back to company A, put their hands out and ask for more money so that they can get the upgrade to the new version. Then they go to company B and they ask for more money from company B so that they can get the upgrades to the new version because company C has already got that.
As you've seen in our discussion, firmware plays a vital role in the functioning of many devices and systems. It is the bridge between the hardware and software, and without it, our devices wouldn't be able to function properly. We hope this information has been helpful and informative, and that you have now a better understanding of the inner workings of the devices and systems that surround us. Thank you for watching!